OK, the second type of XSS attack, it is still the same attack. We're still executing JavaScript with the origin of a bank server or Facebook server. The only difference here is how the attack gets executed. So previously, we saw an attack where the malicious JavaScript was stored on the server forever. In reflected XSS, the difference here is that instead of storing the JavaScript on the server forever, the JavaScript is inputted as part of a request, kind of like that first example we saw with URL parameters. And then whatever's in the request is reflected or copied back in the response from the server. Now, that wording is a little bit weird. So I like to remember reflected XSS with another example. And I think of search. So let's say Google.com doesn't know about XSS attacks, and they're vulnerable. So maybe when someone goes to Google and they type in a query and they press search, the resulting URL will be google.com/search for the search functionality. And then a URL parameter passed in is Q. And then the argument is what the user wants to search for. And maybe in the response always says some number of results were found for the thing that you entered. So in other words, whatever you put here in the URL parameter, it shows up in the response. Somehow the server has decided that anything you put here shows up right here in the HTML response. So as a result, we can play the trick we did before. And instead of passing in a string that's not malicious, like EvanBot, we can pass in a script. And the response will still say, I found this many results for your request, which happens to be the script. And now the person who loads this website will cause this script to execute in their browser. So one difference between reflected XSS and stored XSS is how the attack actually happens. So remember that in stored XSS, if we look at the picture, the request is initiated from the victim. So the victim visits the attacker's profile page, where they visit a bank website with the malicious JavaScript living on it somewhere, and then the bank returns it. So in this case, the victim's the one that makes the request and receives the malicious script. By contrast, in reflected XSS, the victim has to make a request with this injected JavaScript. In other words, the victim can't just visit any old regular website like a profile page. The website that they visit has to specifically have the malicious JavaScript in the URL or somewhere else in the HTTP request. So this is a little bit different from stored XSS, where the user's request didn't have the JavaScript to begin with. Here, the user's request does have the JavaScript, and it gets sent back to them as part of the attack. So here it is in pictures. Instead of first going to the bank to store the malicious JavaScript, the attacker actually goes directly to the victim and says, hey, click on this link. And maybe the link is something malicious, like that. So the attacker says, click on this link. And if the victim gets tricked, then the victim clicks on the link. That link itself has the JavaScript. So this request right here has the JavaScript, for example, in one of those URL arguments. And the bank returns a website with the same input, which is the same malicious script. And the victim script, the script itself runs in the victim's browser. Again, you could steal valuable data. You could send malicious requests. So the end goal is the same. Malicious script is executed by the victim. But the difference is the attack happened by the victim making a URL request with the malicious JavaScript. So one extra requirement here is that we have to trick the victim into clicking on that link with the JavaScript inside. And then the request has the JavaScript, and the response reflects the same JavaScript back at them. And again, I think of search as the classic example of this particular attack.